Welcome. This webinar is Individualized Approaches to Challenging Behavior, presented by AnLar Preschool Access and TRIAD Autism. This presentation was delivered for the AnLar Practice Track webinar series and then also presented at the 2025 SPED Summit. All right, and we are both a part of the Tennessee Technical Assistance Network. The Tennessee Technical Assistance Network is a network of vendors designed to provide free supports and services to districts related to special education with the goal of improving outcomes for children with disabilities. Each vendor provides a different service area. Our organization, AnLar, focuses on preschool and assistance in building capacity and systems to support meaningful access to preschool for students with disabilities. Becky, will you explain what TRIAD Autism does?
Sure. And at TRIAD Autism, we provide training, consultation, and coaching services in order to help support educators and districts in addressing needs that are specific to autistic learners.
Great. The objectives that we'll cover today are to understand and identify challenging behaviors, including approaches to understanding triggers and possible functions for demonstrated behaviors. We'll analyze and identify intervention strategies to minimize behaviors and consider specific examples and how to use strategies to decrease the occurrence of persistent challenging behavior. We'll start with exploring the nature of challenging behavior and discussing how to objectively define and assess it. Response to intervention is defined as the practice of providing high-quality instruction and interventions matched to student need, monitoring progress frequently to make decisions about changes in instruction or goals, and applying child response data to important educational decisions. Tennessee implements a unique version of the RTI model that integrates the principles of quality instruction and intervention, called the Response to Instruction and Intervention RTI2 or RTI squared framework. The RTI squared B framework unites evidence-based problem-solving approaches to address student behavior. The RTI squared B focuses on teaching students appropriate behaviors as opposed to punishing inappropriate behaviors, and also develops positive relationships between students and school staff. While this is a part of a larger system of supports, Tier 1 focuses on foundational practices to implement with all young children for their success in the classroom. Implementing practices to build positive relationships between staff and children, staff and families, and among children is crucial to success of all other practices. Tier 2 provides practices and explicit instruction to support the social skills and emotional regulation of young children. While all children will benefit from more intentional supports and social emotional instruction, some children may require more specific instruction and intervention to prevent challenging behaviors. Young children may need more focused instruction on skills such as expressing emotions, social problem solving, initiating and maintaining peer interactions, anger management skills, etc. Tier 3 provides practices around understanding children's behavior and developing individualized interventions. Once a foundation is set through universal and secondary supports, a few children may continue to exhibit repeated challenging behaviors. They'll benefit from more intensive individualized interventions. Today's webinar will focus on Tier 3 interventions and identifying the functions of challenging behavior to target those interventions. So let's start by considering a definition of the term behavior. Behavior is something that we do. It has a form that we can see, and that form can be defined in a way that allows everyone to observe the same thing. For example, when a child is demonstrating a challenging behavior, you might be asked, what is the child doing? And some of your responses might be, oh, they're being disrespectful or they're ignoring. However, though things such as describing a behavior as disrespectful or ignoring a direction are not necessarily things that you can actually see and define. So for today's webinar, we're going to really think about behavior as something that you can describe and define exactly as what you're seeing. So a behavior might be something like screaming, saying no, kicking, hiding, taking a toy. All of these are things that you can actually see and define. You might be asking yourself as you're seeing that behavior repeatedly, why is the child doing that? Or what's going on? Or what is the child trying to communicate? You really don't know any of that right now. You might have some perceptions or what you might perceive as happening, but until you can take some data and really understand the behavior, you only know what the behavior that the child is demonstrating. Before we move into thinking about how we identify the function of a challenging behavior, I'm going to define some major messages around behavior. You'll understand these in a little more depth as we go, but I want you to keep these in your mind as we go through the next several slides. The key messages are that behavior is learned, it carries meaning, and it serves as a form of communication. We'll explore that in a little bit more depth in the next several slides. Behavior is influenced by environmental factors and experiences. It conveys messages about a person's needs, emotions, and understanding. And it is a way individuals express themselves and interact with their surroundings. Understanding these aspects helps in interpreting and addressing behavior effectively. When you're thinking about addressing challenging behavior, be sure that you're implementing foundational practices with fidelity. Those would be those tier 1 and tier 2 strategies that we mentioned above, or considering other evidence-based practices, which provide a structured framework for understanding and managing behavior effectively. Additionally, considering the influence of family values allows for a culturally responsive approach. Recognize that behaviors may reflect cultural norms and expectations. The expectations of a 4-year-old in one culture may differ from the expectations of a child's behavior in another culture. And it's important for teachers and service providers to consider and understand that when supporting behaviors. Understanding the potential effects of trauma is also essential, as it can significantly impact a child's behavior and emotional regulation. And finally, as a teacher or as a service provider and caregiver, you want to regularly assess your own responses to behavior to ensure that interventions are appropriate and supportive and used consistently, promoting a positive learning environment for all children. So we'll take those major messages forward with us as we consider practicing identifying the function of a challenging behavior. So behavior, such as we named earlier, such as hitting, screaming, or spitting, those are all negative behaviors, but behaviors can also be high fives, right? Or hugs, anything that a child is doing. All behavior has a function and can convey important messages about a child's desires or needs. Understanding these underlying messages is crucial, especially when children lack communication skills like verbalizing or even using any sort of picture system to communicate. Even a child who has a way of communicating may have challenging behavior if they have limited social skills or have learned over time that engaging in a behavior will effectively meet their needs. Children engage in challenging behavior because it works for them. When we talk about challenging behavior, we often see that it's repeated, and we can begin to observe it and identify why that child is repeating that behavior. When we say the behavior works for them, it's because the child is gaining access to something or someone, they're obtaining or getting a request, or it avoids something or someone, such as escape or a protest. We may not always like the message, but we can identify and understand the meaning to develop an appropriately matched intervention. We can determine the function of a behavior, and there's a process for doing so. To determine the function, we use the ABC chain: antecedent, behavior, consequence. Identifying the ABCs is central to the intensive individualized intervention process. To understand behavior, we have to look for clues about what happens before and what happens after the behavior. Behaviors do not just happen out of the blue. So we're going to review each of these in depth. The antecedent, A, is what is observed to happen or occur right before the behavior occurs. This may include specific times of day, such as center time or maybe during arrival time. A setting, is it a whole group activity? Is it a small group activity? Is the child working one-on-one? People, who's involved, who's around the child, and what's happening around that child that we're observing. And activities, what is the child engaging in? And what are the children around the child engaging in? What are the adults doing in the room? For example, was a peer playing with a toy that a child maybe wanted? Or perhaps you, the teacher, were talking with other children, and it had been a bit since the child had received attention from you. All of these are key factors in describing the antecedent to a behavior. Other examples could include the child is asked to do something, someone took something away from the child is having difficulty with a task or wants an object that is not available, or maybe they're asked to stop a preferred activity. Maybe it's a difficult transition and they're asked to move from one activity to another. Knowing when the challenging behavior is most likely to happen and when the challenging behavior is less likely to occur helps us plan how and what to change in the environment to prevent the challenging behavior. It also helps us know when we want to be recording our data, taking data and noting what those antecedents to the behavior are. Next, we'll look at the actual behavior. Now let's consider defining the behavior. We want to be sure that we are defining the behavior in an operationally defined way. Remember, we talked about earlier about describing exactly what can be seen. Behavior is something that we do. It is an action and must be observable. The behavior must result in measurable change. We must be able to measure the behavior. We can count it in some way. We can watch and record the duration, how long that behavior occurs. We can even measure the intensity. How extreme does that behavior it manifest, or what can you see when you're recording that behavior? An operational definition is very specific to ensure that everyone is counting the same action as the behavior of interest. And remember, we're writing down when we record ABC data exactly what can be seen. So we're not going to write down things like the child was being disrespectful or the child ignored the teacher directions. Ignoring would actually probably look like turning away from the teacher, maybe saying no. Those are things that we can actually write down and see in order to operationally define that behavior. And finally, the consequence. What happens directly after the behavior occurs? Sometimes the term consequence is associated with a negative response. But sometimes we'll notice when we watch exactly what happens after the behavior occurs that a child might exhibit what we'd consider a negative behavior, such as hitting or pushing, but the response that they get seems positive to them, such as teacher attention or a child turning to them and responding to them in some way. So, in the case of observing behavior for the ABC chain, the consequence is simply what happens after the behavior occurs and can be positive or negative. For example, maybe the child gets attention. Maybe the child gets an object, such as a toy, or they get help that they wanted. Perhaps they get to continue an activity, or to the contrary, they avoid an activity, which might be non preferred. The consequence tells you what the function is. Either the child gets something or the child avoids something. So let's walk through the steps that you'll take to identify the function of a behavior, and then we'll share a video and give you an opportunity to practice. When observing a challenging behavior, first you want to observe the child's behavior closely. We identify the antecedent. We write down what is happening right before the behavior occurs. What's the setting? What's the child doing? What's the teacher doing or the service provider doing? What are the peers doing around the child? Then we describe the behavior in detail, noting exactly how it looks and sounds. Remember, behavior can be seen. Afterward, we record what happens immediately after the behavior takes place. Finally, we analyze the information gathered to understand why the behavior is happening, aiming to uncover the underlying reasons or triggers behind it. This step-by-step process helps us systematically assess and address challenging behaviors effectively. Okay, now we're going to practice. We're going to watch this child playing in the block center. We're going to watch specifically the child in the red shirt. Using your phone, you can access the QR code on the screen, and this is a simple ABC recording chart. You'll see a column that says A, antecedent, B, the behavior, and C, consequence, with plenty of space to write. So as we watch this video, you'll want to write down exactly what you observe. For today's webinar, we're only going to watch it one time, but we encourage you to pause and record the recording and go back and watch again. That'll help you note all of the things that might be contributing to the behavior that we see. We're going to get this video started. Okay, we're going to play the recording, and as you watch, you'll complete the ABCs that you observe.
And the other one's
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, you may want to rewind and watch that again because we're practicing, right? So we're watching the child in the red shirt. So let's review what you may have observed, recorded, and learned from that behavior. Antecedents. What was happening before? You may have described the full setting that you could see in the video. So the child was playing in centers. You might have recorded that he was in potentially the block center. He was pushing a truck towards other kids. You might have recorded what the other kids were doing. They were playing. They were turned away from him playing with a dollhouse. You could get even more specific. The other kids were turned away from him, from the boy in the red shirt. You might have said that they were playing with dinosaurs. So all of these are things that kind of go into what happened before the behavior occurred. The child in the red shirt pushed the truck towards the children who were turned away from him. Now let's think about the behavior. You may have written down that the boy in the red shirt grabbed, pushed, scratched. It was a little bit difficult to see exactly what that behavior was in the video, or hit the boy in the white shirt. And then what happened immediately after the boy in the red shirt displayed that behavior. Let's think about the consequence. Remember, that's what happens immediately after. The kids turned toward the boy. They yelled at him. They maybe a consequence would have been that they went and told the teacher. Another behavior that we saw with the antecedent that we might have recorded was that the child in the red shirt spit or made a raspberry towards the other children. So there's lots of pieces that you could describe as you observed this interaction. So knowing what you wrote down as the antecedent, the exact behavior, and the consequence, let's consider the function of the behavior. In this scenario, the function that we've identified is that the child was trying to obtain or to get peer attention, right? We could see that the children were turned away from him. He moved towards them. He made one attempt to get their attention, the spitting, and then followed up with a little bit more aggressive behavior. We don't really want to label it as aggressive, but scratching or hitting or pushing, however you defined what you saw as you observed. So the behavior of hitting and scratching. So this was one observation. One observation is not enough to accurately identify the function of behavior every time that the child uses that behavior. So it's important to do many observations of a child to accumulate enough evidence for the function. If peer attention happens after the behavior during multiple observations, then we can likely confirm that that's the function of that child's behavior. So one more thing as we wrap up considering the function of behavior, that there are additional factors that come into play when we're considering a challenging behavior. One thing to think about is that behavior may be dependent on the context. For example, some behaviors are appropriate in one setting and not appropriate in another. A specific example might be running. Running is acceptable outside on the playground, but running is likely not acceptable in the classroom. Another example might be that playing in centers is acceptable during free choice time, but not necessarily during lunchtime. So this is why clearly defined rules and expectations, which are a part of Tier 1 interventions, are very important to make sure that you've established those first. Other things to consider are external factors which may impact or even cause a behavior to occur. Context includes not only what occurred immediately before the behavior, but also setting events, events that are not immediate triggers, but may make the behavior more likely to occur when the immediate trigger happens. These could be things like an ear infection, allergies, hunger, maybe a disruption on the bus or at home before coming to school. Other events, such as a trauma, may have an ongoing effect on the behavior. When you observe behaviors to develop supports and responses, it's important to consider if these setting events are a factor related to the child's challenging behaviors, and also consider strategies to address those events. And I'll hand it over to Becky.
So we are going to now talk through a couple of strategies now that we're more familiar with the function, this idea of function. Now we can think about what our response should be. And so we have several strategies that we can think about. Again, we're kind of living in this tier 3 land for the time being and thinking about strategies that can be used for individual students to better support them in the classroom and try and mitigate some of these occurrences of more difficult and interfering behaviors. And so a couple of strategies, this is not an exhaustive list, but it is a list of strategies that can be really good hip pocket strategies, ones that you can put in place very quickly and can cover a multitude of different behaviors and different functions. And so the first strategy that we want to consider is this idea of free attention. For those of you who are familiar with some more behavior analytic terminology, we like to refer to this as non-contingent reinforcement. But for purposes of today, to kind of keep things as simple as possible, we like to call it free attention because that's what it is. And then the other strategy that we'll talk about is first then, which I am sure most of you, if not all of you, are already familiar with. And so we're going to think about it and open our minds up and see if there's any new information or new approaches that we can gather as we talk about first then. So let's start off with free attention. When we talk about free attention, and we're thinking about this as an individualized intervention or approach, we want to think about, there are some students who find attention to be very motivating, and free attention can be a really powerful strategy for those learners. Free attention is really this idea of providing attention on a regular basis to our learners, regardless of the behavior that they're engaging in. That's why it's free. It is not tied to a behavior. It's not tied to our expectations. It is this notion that we are providing attention no matter what. And then in doing so, we hope to see that there's a reduction in challenging behavior because the learner is then accessing that attention. They have an attentional need. We're filling that attentional need so that they don't have to then engage in the challenging behavior. This strategy is particularly effective for our learners who are engaging in more challenging or difficult behaviors for the function of accessing attention, especially that adult attention, because we can control the amount of attention that we're providing as the adult when we implement free attention. Very powerful strategy. So let's kind of think about this in action. So we might have a student who they need attention, right? They come to school, they're thinking to themselves, oh, I'm feeling so lonely. Nobody wants to play with me. All my friends are over there playing together and having a good time, and I'm over here by myself. And their attention bucket starts to deplete. We saw one of those shapes fly out. Some time passes. The student thinks, I'm still lonely. And look what happens. Their attention bucket is totally empty. At this point, what might happen is the student engages in some sort of difficult, challenging behavior. And what do we see? We see a response. Hey, I need you to use nice hands. We don't hit in this classroom. Remember, we are kind to everybody. And the cycle continues. But what if we were to kind of flip the script a little bit? So we know we have this student who they might come in and feel pretty lonely, and they might have difficulty making friends in their classroom. And so, but we also know that they really value attention. And so here's what I'm going to do as the teacher who's implementing free attention now. I'm going to immediately provide some sort of attention. So that way I fill their bucket right away. Some time passes, naturally the bucket starts to empty a little bit, but I know approximately how long this learner can go before they need another dose of attention. And so I'm going to beat them to it, right? And I'm going to make sure before their attention bucket empties that I go ahead and I give them some more attention. Hey, guess what? Look outside. It's so sunny today. Today is going to be a perfect playground day. And I know how much you love that playground and you love going on those swings, and we are going to swing together. It's going to be so fun. And the student's bucket starts to fill back up. And it's this idea of continuing on that schedule of attention giving so that we can keep the student's bucket as full as possible throughout the day. So that way they don't end up having to solicit attention by engaging in any negative or unwanted behavior. When we think about free attention, that's what it is. It's free. It's not transactional. It's not based on a relationship. It's not based on the student's performance in the class. It's not based on their behavior in the moment. We use it preventatively. We want to try and kind of make sure, like I said, that that attention bucket doesn't deplete so that they don't have to engage in any unwanted behaviors. They can continue to engage in the behaviors that are going to benefit them in the classroom and benefit their learning. And when we use free attention, we put it in place in an individualized manner because we know that one size does not fit all. One student's attentional bucket might differ greatly in size compared to another student's attentional bucket. One student might need attention every couple of minutes. Another student might be able to let 10 minutes pass before they get attention. And so we really need to think about the unique needs of each individual learner for whom we're putting free attention into place. So that is a very high level overview of free attention. We do have some additional online learning modules about free attention that I would encourage you to look at if this seems like a strategy that could be a really nice match for any of your learners. Again, it's pretty quick and easy to put in place. It doesn't require a lot of extra supports and materials. It just requires you taking some data on the front end to figure out kind of how long does this learner seem to go before they need attention, and then setting a timer and beating them to it. So it's a pretty low effort strategy, which makes it one of my favorite strategies out there. Another kind of lesser effort strategy, but really effective, is this concept of first then. And like I said, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this strategy and are hopefully even implementing it in your classroom. And so I want us to approach this with a beginner's mindset of, while we might know about this, am I talking about it in a new way potentially? Is there any information that we share today that could be helpful to take back to the other adults working in your classroom? Are there new approaches that you haven't considered before that might be effective for any of your learners? And so kind of keep that open mindset as we explore this concept of first then. When we think about first then, I think a lot of times I might walk into a classroom and see it being used, which is fantastic, but it might be being used as a mini schedule of sorts in which you're breaking down kind of the flow and the sequence and order of events. Mini schedules are wonderful. I would encourage us to use first then, if you're not already using it like this, as more of a reinforcement system paired with a visual support. And so when we think about what's on that first side of a first then, it's whatever it is that the student needs to complete. And typically it's going to be something that's neutral or even less preferred, that the student might have some difficulty completing. They're not as motivated to complete it because it is neutral or less preferred. And on the then side, we have some sort of reinforcing activity, a preferred item, a preferred activity, maybe attention from the adult. Again, we can link it back to that function of behavior that Rachel talked about. And so it really becomes this first, then, first work, then reward system. And that's the idea behind a true first then, and making it a really kind of more reinforcement-based strategy. So here's an example. First, you need to color, then you can have your favorite toys. Or maybe we do first work and then free choice time. Keep it really generic, really simple. What I love in that first example is we are pairing that first then language with a visual support. I support a lot of autistic learners, and we know that many autistic learners thrive when we make abstract concepts concrete, and we can do that through the use of visual supports. And so the language is fantastic language to be using, but if I can then map that language onto some sort of visual so that it really comes to life for our learners, that becomes such a powerful tool. So I would encourage you to think about some kind of visual component when you're using first then. Even if it's you take a Post-it note and you quickly kind of scribble on the Post-it note, first we do this and then you get this. It doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be effective in the moment. So I'm going to preface this. We're going to watch a video. And Rachel, just make sure the sound is working on my end because I'm not hearing things. But this is a teacher working with this learner, our young learner, and she has a first then board in front of her. And so the teacher is going to kind of outline and articulate what the first then needs to be. And so I want you to pay attention to the language that the teacher is using, kind of what other strategies she's bringing into the mix in addition to first then, and just kind of see if we can kind of follow the flow of the first then process. So I'm going to play the video and then we'll debrief.
Okay, first we're going to do some work, and then we're going to get a sticker. Okay, here we go. Do another one. Touch red. You found it! Nice job! Touch green. Nice job! High five, girlfriend. All right. Touch blue. Yeah, the blue one. Very nice. Okay. I want you to do this. Ready? Your turn. Ready? Your turn.
Can she share with you?
Yay! You did it! Nice job! Okay, ready to go get a sticker? Let's go.
All right. I just love this video. Firstly, this learner is just the most adorable thing. And so I think it just looks like a very fun session of teaching and learning happening. And so what I love is the teacher started off by using the first then. She kept it very generic, first work, then sticker, right? And so this learner, not necessarily a reader yet, but the first then just had the written words on it. That's okay. That visual support was there. The learner had been introduced to this idea of first then, and so she understands that whatever goes on that first side means that's the work she has to do, but then it's a contractual obligation that the teacher has set with her of, if you do what's on this first side, then I'm going to make sure you get whatever is on this then side, which was the sticker. And so she didn't have to be able to read it. She just had to know that the teacher was pairing her words with that visual support, and it was very effective. The other pieces that I love about this video is it shows that strategies don't happen in isolation. When we are teaching, we are using so many different strategies and tools in our tool belt at the same time. And this teacher was doing exactly that. So she put the first then in place to keep the student motivated and on track during a difficult activity. And that difficult activity was the stacking of the cups. It required a lot of motor planning. It was a skill that she was not yet fluent in, and she needed support and motivation to stick with it. But before she even got into that difficult activity, the teacher used a strategy we like to call behavioral momentum. And she started off with something that the student is very successful with, of identifying the different colors. And so you could see her confidence was building while she was identifying the colors, and then they moved into that more difficult activity of stacking the cups. And then the teacher didn't just let her fail, right? She could see she was struggling. She wasn't able to do it yet independently. And so the teacher started to build in some prompts, and she provided some gestural prompts. She provided some positional prompts. She provided a hand over hand prompt. So she used a combination of strategies and evidence-based practices in order to support this learner. But the first then was put in place as a motivational piece. It was the reinforcement that kind of kept her going while also leaning on these other strategies in order to ensure success for the learner. So we like to see kind of that marriage of all different approaches and strategies and practices, and that's what makes it successful. So like I said, we do have a number of different resources for you to do some additional learning and digging into these strategies. I put on the screen a QR code for you to access this printable resource about First Then. We also, hot off the presses, have a new module about First Then. So you can log into our online learning platform and access that module for free. The other QR code is a module about free attention. And so if you're logged into the platform, you can access that free attention module along with that First Then module. So I encourage you to check out those resources. They're great for additional learning. They don't take very much time either. They're also fantastic resources to share with any other classroom staff who are working in your classrooms or with students that you support. So now we are going to do a little practice of putting some of these strategies into action. So we're going to look at two different scenarios, classroom scenarios, and I want you to take a few moments. You can pause the video when we show you the scenario, read through the scenario, and then take a moment to consider which strategies might you put in place for the children in the scenarios. Could you use free attention? Could you use First Then? Are there other strategies that you might consider using in addition? Because we know that these strategies don't happen in isolation. And so let's start off with our scenario number one. We're going to read about Gabriel. So I'm just going to tell you to pause the video, read the scenario, think through the strategies, and then we'll just debrief in a moment. Okay, so hopefully you've had some time after you paused the video to read through and think about the strategies. So thinking about Gabriel, we know transitioning is very difficult for him, especially around that lunchtime transition. Coming in from recess, super preferred, going to lunch, it's a big transition. In the midst of it, he has to wash his little hands, and oh, that's just torture. And so we need to put some strategies in place to help Gabriel, not only during that transition, but also once he gets to lunchtime. And so if we think about First Then and free attention, I think we could probably use these strategies to help Gabriel. I think First Then could be really powerful. Maybe we give him a visual of first we wash our hands, then we eat lunch, assuming that Gabriel's really excited about actually eating, and that's really reinforcing. If we think about some other strategies that we could put in place, we could offer him some choices when he does get to lunch of where he wants to sit, or who he wants to sit with, or bringing a preferred object with him. In terms of thinking about that free attention piece, during lunchtime, I would be making sure to provide free attention throughout lunch to really make sure he's enjoying that lunchtime period. He is not having to engage in the lunch period by himself. He's getting access to that free attention, especially since the afternoons do seem to be a little bit more difficult for him. That free attention can kind of keep him on track throughout the afternoon. So, visual schedules would probably be beneficial. There's lots of different strategies that we can use, but we can definitely use our first, then, and free attention strategies to support Gabriel. Lots of other ways that we could put those in place, but those would just be some initial considerations. So now I'm going to let Rachel walk us through our next scenario.
Great, thanks, Becky. So yes, our next scenario, we're thinking about morning meeting time, that large group kind of circle time that many classrooms traditionally have, and we're thinking about Luke. So I'm going to pause and let you guys read this scenario about Luke, and take a few minutes to consider what strategies you might use and how you might apply them to this specific scenario. Another thing I'd encourage you to do is think about that ABC recording chart. What might you write down as the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence? So we'll pause for just a second for you to read and practice both of those skills of recording your ABC chart and also considering some appropriately matched strategies. Okay, so I hope you had some time to kind of read through this. Think about using that ABC chart. If this were an actual child in your classroom, what would you have write down for that antecedent? You might write down that he was prompted to clean up from morning activities and told to go to the carpet. So we're kind of thinking about how this scenario would unfold in a classroom and what it would look like to record that behavior. What we see as the behavior is Luke leaving the circle to go grab a toy from the toys next to the teacher or the items next to the teacher. And then we see Luke crawling away from his spot again to take materials off the shelf. So and then the consequence of being the teachers are trying to redirect him back to the circle. So we could write some details around that if we were actually observing that behavior. And so what I would guess is, just from what we know here, and of course we need to observe multiple times, is that Luke is trying to potentially obtain items that he wants, or we'd have to watch a few times. Potentially morning meeting is a difficult time for him. There's a lot of kids around. And so he might be trying to avoid any demands or requests that may be happening during morning meeting. We don't know all the details in this written scenario, but both of those could be possible options there for identifying that function of the behavior. So you may have come up with some different strategies that you could use. So certainly free attention could be used 100%. If you know that it's a pattern that Luke, once he leaves those morning activities and comes to the circle, then we kind of begin to engage in this difficult time of trying to escape the circle or trying to obtain things, then we're going to start piling on that free attention, that noticing of, giving him some praise and some reinforcement. Look how you're sitting, high five, kind of keeping him somewhat distracted with that extra attention, giving him high fives. Look at the book that the teacher has. We're just piling kind of on that attention to support him through this morning meeting time. Another thing that you might use is that first then. So this could be paired with some other tools in your toolbox, not ones that we specifically shared today, but using a choice chart. So you could pair a choice board. So once Luke sits, first sit for maybe an extended amount of time. Maybe it's 1 minute, maybe it's 2 minutes. That's going to vary based on your observations of Luke and how long he's capable of sitting there at that moment. But first sit, and he gets reinforced with a choice that he's made off his choice board. So that also kind of fills that need for him to go and get toys, right? He's got it right there at his disposal. So he's not needing to leave and escape to go to find those items that he wants to engage with. So using that first, then paired with a choice chart, that visual reinforcement or that object reinforcement that he can hold on to, and beginning to increase his ability to stay in that circle area. And then potentially giving him, he looks like he's wanting to escape. So maybe we're working for that escape. First set for 5 minutes. 5 might be a stretch, 3 minutes, then he gets to go and spend some time in a preferred area in the classroom, and then we transition back and do it all over again. So first, then providing that frequent free attention, that positive, noticing language, praise, and reinforcement, and then also pairing that with giving him some choices over what he wants to engage with. So those are some ideas of how you might apply both the ABC recording as well as the strategies that Becky shared to support Luke in this scenario. All right, and we are not at the summit, but we did present this at the summit. So if you have questions, you can reach out to Becky with TRIAD Autism or myself with AnLar Preschool Access, and we can provide additional supports. We also have additional webinars, recorded webinars and content around these strategies that we shared with you today, and would be happy to share that as well. All right. Thank you.